So I'm Dr. Grandela. Here we're talking about genetic testing and gene therapy today. This is our May informational webinar. I thought that this was a really important topic for us to hit, genetic testing and gene therapy, because we have a lot of patients who have inherited retinal conditions, and we have a lot of patients who have a family history of some kind of eye disease, like there's been glaucoma in your family for generations, or both your brother and your sister have macular degeneration. So patients will ask me all the time, what are the chances I have of passing this thing on to someone? If someone in my family has it, what's the chance that I'm going to get it? Patients will often bring a spouse with them or a child with them. We'll often bring up these questions of, well, nobody's diagnosed macular degeneration, but what can we do just in case it's going to happen? So I hope that this webinar will answer some questions into that regard. And if not, let it bring up more questions. Come and let me know. For anybody who's watching live, feel free to put questions into the chat, and I'll answer what I can towards the end. This is on Facebook Live, but will later get reposted to YouTube as well, and onto our website. So genetic testing and gene therapy. A big disclaimer that I want to put out. We at ViewFinder and I myself, Dr. Grandela, don't receive any kind of financial incentives for genetic testing. We're not associated with any genetic companies. We're not involved in any genetic research. I didn't specialize in genetics in school or anything like that. So this is just an important topic to touch on in relation to low vision. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and proceed. So what are genes? Let's start at, level 101. You've heard about DNA, I'm sure. Your DNA makes up all the instructions for who you are and what your body is, and genes are what makes up your DNA. Genes, in turn, are made of little molecules called amino acids that they are set up in a coded form. And so your whole blueprint for your physical being is put into this coded form. And the way that your body reads that and what those instructions say have everything to do with genetic conditions and with why your hair is blonde or why your eyes are brown or X, Y, Z, and the other. So problems can occur when your blueprints are not written correctly. So when genes are out of order, when genes become mutated. So, if you're the first person in the world to have purple eyes, it's likely because of a gene mutation, unless you got bit by a radioactive spider or something like that. And that might mutate. Anyway, that's another tangent. Genes get duplicated in some conditions like Down syndrome, trisomy 21. Where we have extra genes that shouldn't be there, and they start to cause problems because we are using extra instructions that don't need to get used. Genes can also cause a problem when they're missing. So a great example of this would be Turner syndrome, where we're missing a chromosome and a whole set of genes, causes different problems like that. So we want our full set of instructions, we want them written appropriately, and we want to be able to study these instructions. We have mapped in large part the human genome, but we're still figuring out what a lot of those genes mean. We have the whole blueprints there, but as a society, as a world, we're still figuring out a lot about what genes do and how those blueprints are used by the body. Over in the right-hand corner, I've got a couple little graphs up just to show kind of the idea of these instructions. Along a strand of DNA, you'll have any kind of a code going on. And so we have, this TACCA, CAA, CTCG. So your DNA is written out one way, and that will get transcribed into RNA. RNA was made in, a big to-do about that with the COVID vaccine coming out. RNA then takes that information to ribosomes to make proteins. Proteins go on to have various functions throughout the body. There's quite a bit more to what's going on in this, but if that code is out of place, then the transcription can go wrong, proteins can go wrong, cause all kinds of different issues. And the box that's kind of in the middle where it says UCAG on the top and then down the side kind of gives a hint to the different way that these letters are put together codes for different proteins. And those proteins come in different combinations. And sometimes there's specific instructions, like, or let's say stop a couple times here, like U and A and U and G. That's a signal to the DNA transcription process to make different changes. So a lot of intense stuff going on here. You imagine we fiddle with any of this, big ramifications throughout our whole body. Why are genetics important to your vision? Well, genetics affects everything in your body. So your vision, your eyeballs, just one part of that. How your body expresses your genetic information, so how we take those blueprints and then use the results from it, can determine how risky you are for having a certain disease, the age that you'll be at when those diseases hit. So there are some conditions start in pediatric stages, some don't start till you're in your 20s, some don't hit till you're after you're 50. The severity of your vision loss could also be attributed to, certain genes, the likelihood of passing this on to your kids, and just your overall metabolism is affected by genes. And metabolism is a whole other conundrum that can affect how your eyes are, the health that you have going on, the vision that you can get through it. So genetics are very, very important. They play a role in everything. So we can't set that aside with the eyes. It's definitely something we want to look into for anybody who has a family history of a condition. What kinds of eye conditions have a genetic link? Well, there is a hereditary ocular disease database out of Arizona State University. Very cool site to go into and look at, all the submissions they've had for different conditions. So this is a small list, but they have, pages and pages of different genetic conditions just for the eyes. So it's a really cool thing to look through. Among these would be achromatopsia, where there's a loss of cone cells and loss of color vision. Albinism, where there's a loss of pigment, and that can be ocular albinism, where it's just in the eyeball itself, or oculocutaneous, which is on your skin as well. When you think of someone who's has albinism, you think of blonde hair, light-colored skin, blue eyes. That's the oculocutaneous version, and there's varying degrees among that. Aniridia, which is a lack of an iris. There's a few different, a spectrum of how that occurs as well. So aniridia, big condition as well. Juvenile cataracts, many different flavors and shapes of how cataracts can show up. But typically someone's not going to have cataracts till, after their 50s. We're thinking definitely by the 70s, we're talking about cataracts at some point. There are kids that are born with cataracts. They're born with, this lens that's malformed or has some kind of a opacity in the middle of it, and that leads to all their kinds of conditions. Cone dystrophy, similar in some respects to achromatopsia, but there's again a spectrum of these disorders and different genes involved with them. Corneal dystrophies, where this again can affect all different layers of the cornea, many different kinds of conditions. This can cause corneas that are opaque, corneas that swell, corneas that are misshapen. Glaucoma, both the juvenile form, where a child can be born with glaucoma, or the adult form that hits much later in life. Keratoconus, which would be a corneal condition where the corneas are very thin, very peaked in appearance, very, very intense condition to work on, but can have great results. This can have genetic link as well. Leber's, which can refer to either Leber's congenital amaurosis, which is more of a retinal condition, and Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, which is an optic nerve or nervous tissue condition. Both of these very severe and can be blinding. Definitely genetic link to those. Macular degeneration in a couple different forms, genetic component there. Different macular dystrophies, which is different than degeneration, different than just the cone dystrophy. It's actually, over the whole retina itself, depending on the disease, not just the sensory tissue. Myopia, which is nearsightedness. So anything from someone who's a moderate myope like myself, I've got about a -3 prescription, to someone who's a high myope who might be a -10 or -6, -20 I've seen. This leads into what's called degenerative myopia, where the more nearsighted you are, in many cases, the longer your eyeball is. The longer your eyeball is, the more the retinal tissue gets stretched and damaged and is likely to detach or tear or have all kinds of other scarring issues. So myopia has a big genetic component. So even if you're just someone who's a moderate myope, like myself and my wife, and I've thought, okay, what's my likelihood of passing this on to my kids? How much of this is nature and how much is nurture? So I'm doing everything I can on the nurture side to prevent my kids from having nearsightedness. So far, so good. But there may be a genetic link in there that's going to overtake the nurturing aspect. Optic atrophy, so atrophy of the optic nerve. Retinitis pigmentosa, which is a huge condition as far as inherited retinal conditions, comes in many forms and shapes. Retinoschisis, other conditions like foveoschisis as well, Stargardt disease, and septo-optic dysplasia, which goes in line with several other conditions like foveal hypoplasia, optic nerve hypoplasia. Hypoplasia means it's not never developed correctly. So as opposed to atrophy, where it was developed correctly and then it started to thin out and die, hypoplasia means it never grew in the first place. Dysplasia means it grew incorrectly. So septo-optic dysplasia usually involves both brain tissue and optic nerves growing incorrectly, and that could be an underdevelopment or an incorrect development. Again, genetic links to all these things. So we can see here, huge spectrum of people that this little talk might apply to, people who should be interested in how their genes relate to their eye care. So how does knowing your genetic background help? Well, helps to set realistic life goals and expectations. Now, when I say that, I don't want anybody to hear this lecture and feel like, well, Dr. Grandela said that if your genes tell you you have a disease, just give up on driving and just give up on having a job. It's not what I mean at all. If anybody has come in to see me, I hope the feeling they get out of their exam with me is that you can do anything in spite of vision loss. It's just a matter of finding the right adaptations, finding the right way to be independent, to be functional, to accomplish these goals and hobbies. Highly unlikely with vision loss that you'll do things the same way. It requires adaptations, like many things in life. But knowing your genetic background, if you know that you have retinitis pigmentosa, for example, where you're going to have side vision loss and maybe eventually total loss, night blindness, things like that, well, you may not want to work as a nighttime security guard. You may not want to take up a career as a truck driver. There are, if that's your dream and love and ambition, there are ways to figure those things out, I'm sure. But setting life goals and expectations help you decide who and what you want to be in life. Family planning. I think this is a big one as well. I don't want anybody to say, Dr. Grandela said, don't have kids if you have an eye condition. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is you should know what your risks are of a child acquiring an eye disease, from you. For some people, that's a big deal. And they may say, I don't ever want to pass this on to someone else. For others, they may say, there's nothing wrong with me. My condition is my condition. It makes me different. It's a part of who I am, and I'm not ashamed of that. And I would be happy to have a kid who had my condition as well. These are very personal things. But knowing your genetic background, I think, will add a lot into how you make those decisions and the conversations you have with your significant others and how you move forward. So very personal, very useful stuff. And we only ever want to be supportive of the decisions our patients are making and their life decisions and moving forward and giving you all the resources and tools that we can. Confirming your diagnosis. For many patients, they may go and see the doctor, and there's nothing in our physical testing that will pinpoint their condition versus another condition. It will require advanced genetics to really give us the final say. Um, there are many conditions we can figure out by doing an in-depth, retina scan or nerve scan, taking fundus photos, doing intravitreal injections. All kinds of diagnostic testing can be done. But there are cases where we want a genetic confirmation. That may open the door to specific treatment plans. It may avoid treatment plans of a similar condition that we wouldn't have known without the confirmation. It may open the door to participate in clinical trials where this is not an approved medication or research, but it's something that we're working towards FDA approval. Again, we don't participate in any of that, but many of our partnering retina doctors do. So good information to have determines your eligibility, and if nothing else, the more we know about how many people have the condition, the more research will go into these things, the more grant money gets put towards these things. If no one gets genetic testing for, let's say, albinism, if nobody got genetic testing for that and nobody went to their doctor for albinism, we would have a very poor idea of what the real population was of people who have albinism. The more testing we do, the more people who go to their doctor, the more numbers get reported, more likely that will be researched into. Funding will be put towards that because they'll say, well, look at this problem here. We have so many people. Let's put that ahead of this problem that very few people bring up. Also gives you access to national advocacy groups and supportive organizations. There are many of these. Many are particular to your condition. So for albinism as an example, we have NOAA, which is the National Organization for Albinism and Hypopigmentation. There are many macular degeneration groups, glaucoma groups. So if you're looking for support or for advocacy, having a genetic diagnosis could aid you in your affiliation there. And also awareness for future treatment breakthroughs. So we know that there's not cures for a lot of things today, but as they continue to work on this, if you have your genes, tested out and coded, and your doctor knows that when a research treatment comes to light, comes through FDA approval, and your doctor's going through the list of people to contact about that new treatment, you want to be on that list, I would imagine. So a few examples pulling off of this slide of how we might confirm a diagnosis or separate different similar conditions. Here's a slide on retinitis pigmentosa versus Usher syndrome. In retinitis pigmentosa, we have these pigmented spots that show up on the retina. So these are two retinal photos. In the photo, we have a yellow circle. That is the optic nerve. So what we're looking at there isn't actually a circle. It's more like a tunnel going backwards. So the optic nerve comes into that blind spot area in our retina. And in and out of that tunnel run veins and arteries that feed the retina, keep it healthy, give it nutrients, take away the trash, that kind of stuff. Well, in these pictures, we can see these dark spots coming on the outside of this picture. This is the central portion of vision. The very center of the photo is what we call the macula. That's the area of your best vision. So in retinitis pigmentosa, we have this outwards towards inwards progression of vision loss. And so these clumps of dark pigment, we call them bone spicules. I don't know who came up with that name. But this progresses outwards to inwards. Now, these two pictures are very similar. There's a difference in color and a difference in photo quality, but that's just who took the picture and the camera that they used. That's not an indication of the health. There's really nothing in looking at a fundus image, a retinal image, between retinitis pigmentosa and Usher syndrome that would tell you that these are different conditions. If you went and sat down and talked to the patient, walked through their whole eye exam and daily life and things like that, they both have side vision loss. They may both get central loss at advanced stages. They both have night blindness. They both may run into things or trip over things because they can't see them, require a cane or a walker or a wheelchair or some kind of a device to help them orient themselves. They'll also be very sensitive to light. But what you get with Usher syndrome is not only retinitis pigmentosa, but also hearing loss. And so that's the patient who comes in who is not only blind, but deaf. It may not be deaf. There are varying spectrum of what goes on in Usher syndrome. A lot of this can be sussed out in genetic testing. So confirming diagnoses, if you have a patient who has retinitis pigmentosa and has hearing loss, I would want to get a genetic test and say, are these due to the same thing, or is this part of something else? And we get more and more information from that. Okay, going back to that slide, other things that are helpful, clinical trials. Let's talk about clinicaltrials.gov for a moment. This is part of the National Institute of Health, the U.S. National Library of Medicine. You can go to, type it in just like that, clinicaltrials.gov. You can look up any specific conditions or medications. You can look at past trials that have been done, current recruiting trials, trials that are on their way and they're not yet recruiting. So I went and pulled out a bunch of eye condition trials that are currently recruiting. So if any of this rings a bell for you and is your condition as you listen to this, hop on clinicaltrials.gov. There may be a research trial that you could be a part of. It's up to you whether or not you would want to be a guinea pig. Many people are all for it, want to get into the research. If there's a chance that it'll help, let's do it. Other people are more cautious and say, I don't want to have any kind of funny experiments done until this is something known and proven. So current recruiting genetic clinical trials, I looked at this week, X-linked retinoschisis. So that means it comes on the X chromosome. Retinitis pigmentosa, so we talked about that already. Usher syndrome, achromatopsia, Leber's congenital amaurosis, wet and neovascular macular degeneration. So wet degeneration, we get a lot of macular degeneration patients, so let me explain that for a moment. Wet degeneration is when we start to have liquid and or blood seeping into the retina because of the level of decay that's gone on. So there are trials specifically for that and specific to neovascular macular degeneration. We don't hear that as often. That's when not only is it wet, but new blood vessels are growing in that shouldn't be there. And those new blood vessels cause all kinds of problems. Choroideremia, Bieti's crystalline dystrophy, Plaquenil-induced retinopathy. We've got to talk about that as well. Plaquenil is also known as hydroxychloroquine, made very famous by the antics of this last year or so in the pandemic. So if you've taken hydroxychloroquine at high levels, you may have a level of vision loss related to that. And there's a gene trial going on about that. Fuchs corneal dystrophy, vitelliform macular dystrophy, also known as Best dystrophy, and diabetic retinopathy with macular edema. So if you have diabetes and it's gotten into your eye and it's caused swelling in the macula, that's something that they're doing clinical trials for. Now, these are only genetic clinical trials. So if we're talking about gene therapies or genetic research, this is not talking about stem cells or not talking about pharmaceuticals. That's a whole nother presentation we could do. We're not going to get into that today. But for patients who want to know about other treatments, clinicaltrials.gov, you should really take time to look into that and check on it periodically and bring trials up to your doctors. They may be participating in it. These trials are across the country. So perhaps, let's say you have Fuchs corneal dystrophy and you find that there's a pilot study going on for a new treatment for that. That may be across the country in Florida or in Maine, or it may be down the street. So it'll take some time to dig into each of these things. Just because you have the condition does not mean that you're eligible for it. They may have to check you genetically to see if you're the right kind of retinitis pigmentosa, the right kind of achromatopsia. They may also test out your vision or your visual field and say you are qualified or not qualified based on how much vision you have. That's very important as well. So not everyone who has a condition is eligible for trials. If you are eligible, I think that puts a little impetus on you to be a part of it, in my opinion. But Very, very, again, personal decisions people should be making. Here again, some more resources for you guys to look at. How can I have my genes identified? Well, there's different routes you can go about this, but typically it involves saliva testing, cheek tissue swabs, or a blood sample. You can go and see a genetic counselor for this. That's somebody who will walk you through, what kind of genetic testing you should have done and how many genes they should test and what that will mean for your life. And they can sit and talk to you about results. There are also online services like 23andMe and Ancestry. They do include some tests for vision-related genes, but these tests are often looking for a much wider pool of conditions. They're looking for diabetes in general. They're looking for, cystic fibrosis or myasthenia gravis or, all kinds of different stuff. Obesity. They're not just looking at the eyes. So my suggestion would be go to a couple of companies that are out there that are very specific to the eyes, not looking really at anything else. So we have a couple examples here for that. And I do have with me a testing kit from one of our local testing groups. And so just to show you kind of what that would look like if we were to use a testing kit. So here's one example of a little packet that you could get in the mail or get in a doctor's office. You would, for a saliva kit, open up a very similar tube to like this, and then you spit into it until you fill it up to the line. Once it's filled up, then that gets properly sealed and sent off to a lab. And typically you're going to expect to get results back in a couple weeks. It could be faster than that, it could be slower than that. The COVID mail situation has put a dampener on ones that I've sent in. So really not super difficult. Can be done at home in some situations. The packet I just opened is from a group called ID Your IRD. IRD stands for Inherited Retinal Disease. So this is not looking for glaucoma or not looking for optic nerve conditions. This is specific to things like retinitis pigmentosa or Stargardt's disease or cone dystrophy, or the list goes on and on. Patients who are eligible to have this testing would have peripheral vision loss, night blindness, color vision loss, central vision loss, light sensitivity, or any kind of a systemic syndrome with one of those symptoms as well. You don't have to have all of these symptoms. You could have any one of those, and that would make you eligible for this. This is a free testing kit. Doesn't cost your doctor anything, doesn't cost you anything. But you do have to have a doctor's signature on this. They want you to go and see somebody and have an eye exam. Anybody also with a patient family history of an inherited eye disease is also eligible. So maybe you don't have any symptoms at all, but your brother has oculocutaneous albinism, or you had a grandpa who had cone rod dystrophy, or the list goes on and on. You would also be eligible for this as well. This specific testing regimen tests for almost 300 genes, all related to eye disease. They specifically do not test for macular degeneration. So while there are genetic components to that, that's not what this test is looking for. So ID Your IRD is a great one you can look at. Another one would be My Retina Tracker. My Retina Tracker is put together by the Foundation Fighting Blindness in cahoots with Blueprint Genetics and Informed DNA. I don't know the particulars to who does what in there, but so these three groups together have a similar, saliva testing kit. Patients are eligible for this if they've been diagnosed with an inherited retinal disease. So this test would be a confirmation for that, like we were talking about before. Or if they have had no genetic testing, well, they have to have had no genetic testing for inherited retinal conditions after 2016. And they don't just have macular degeneration, glaucoma, optic neuropathy, corneal disease, diabetic eye disease, or other acquired ocular diseases. The reason they have that list is these are all conditions we get much later in life. While they may have genetic components, they're not as particular as some of the inherited retinal conditions. So what they're saying here is that, you have symptoms outside of just what's going on in those conditions. That's who they're looking for, is retinitis pigmentosa, Stargardt's disease, these other conditions that are inherited, would start earlier in life, more pediatric. So extensive testing done for this, 322 genes. Whew, I'm running over my words. I need a little water. But not meant for people who have an acquired condition. So there are tests out there for that. Again, 23andMe has macular degeneration testing, and there's a few different formats we can go through. So these are two of the big ones, ID your IRD and my Retina Tracker. So what is a gene therapy? Going back again to that slide that we had about how does knowing my genetic background help? Well, one of this is participating in the clinical trials that are about genetic therapies or getting access to new treatment breakthroughs. Well, what are these new therapies? Why would I want one in the first place? So a gene therapy works in that a virus is used to attach to your cells, inject itself, and rewrite the DNA. Now, viruses do this all the time already. There are specific viruses. Adenovirus is the one listed on here. These are viruses that's how they populate themselves. They get in your body, they take over a cell, they rewrite the DNA to make billions and millions of these viruses, and that's how they reproduce and get throughout your body, and you sneeze them onto somebody else. Well, they have taken these viruses and rewritten their DNA, taken out the pathogenic parts, the parts where they're just, sending out nasty problems through your body, and they've put in the code for the genes that we need to fix for this particular condition. So Stargardt's disease, for example, is related to the ACBA4 gene. So if we were doing a gene therapy for Stargardt's, we would be sending in a virus to fix that ACBA4 gene. Whatever was the issue, the mutation or the incorrect placement, this virus would come in, it would reconstruct the DNA with the proper gene, and then that would go throughout the body, and as this cell continues to reproduce, that cell is now reproducing in your body with the correct genes. And so in this way, we can rewrite someone's DNA and take away the mutation that's causing the problem, and then allow them to have, a perfectly healthy, normal system again. It's complex stuff, huh? Kind of a scary thought to think about injecting a virus into yourself, but this is, again, something that has to be FDA approved and tested, and, will be given what the side effects are and things like that. So then comes the question, well, what eye conditions have a gene therapy available? There are only 20 FDA-approved gene therapy treatments, and only one of them is for the eyes. That one is Luxturna, and that's for retinitis pigmentosa with a specific gene of RPE65. Now, that's the only one that's approved today. There are, like we were saying, more in the works and part of clinical trials. So definitely something to pay attention to and to keep your eyeballs on. No pun intended. Luxturna, let's talk about that a little bit. That is made by a company called Spark Therapeutics. Ooh, and we can't see their logo too well anymore because of the black background. But Luxturna is a gene therapy, so it's a virus that's being injected, and it is injected into the retina. So this is specific for RPE65, which is the most common gene mistake for retinitis pigmentosa. It was approved in 2017, so it's only 4 years old. So if you haven't heard about this and you have retinitis pigmentosa, that's because it's only 4 years old. Go into your doctor and ask them about it. If you haven't been genetically tested, it's a free test. It doesn't hurt you anything to do it. And if you have the gene, Spark Therapeutics will come knocking on your door. They want you to have this for sure. It's a very expensive medication. I couldn't give you the list price. I don't have it myself, and I haven't asked. but it's something that not everybody's getting. Something that can be really beneficial. We've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about kids who get this and it restores their vision entirely, or they never lose any more vision afterwards. Mileage is going to vary on any kind of medication. I don't want to give false hope on anything. If you go on the Luxturna website and read through their clinical trials, they were testing patients in a lot of different ways. They looked at visual acuity, or the clarity of your vision. They looked at visual field, and then they developed an extra test where they had kind of an obstacle course. Um, it was a little bit different, kind of cool to look. There's images on Luxturna, actually a video that you can watch about it. They did varying levels of light. We know retinitis pigmentosa is going to have night blindness, so the darker the room is, the harder it is for them. After this injection, over half of the 31 people who participated in this study had improvement in their ability to get through the room at varying levels of light. And they were showing that, this over 0.5% could do it 2 levels darker than they were able to do it prior. So that is actually pretty fair improvement, even though the bullet point doesn't look that impressive. You go watch the video, look at the study, a pretty cool thing to think about. And as many patients will tell me, any improvement may be worth it. In the picture down to the bottom right, we see an eyeball there and a syringe being stuck into it. That is actually kind of what's going on. This is an injection of this virus to the very particular location into the retina. And those viruses are then going to go in and infect the sensory cells that are picking up the light and making those signals. And that's where this damage is happening, is down those sensory cells and in the pigment layers there. And these cells are going to be infected. Their DNA is going to be corrected. And then as those cells continue to reproduce, we are going to have reproducing healthy retina instead of this defective RPE65 gene. So what a wonderful thing for this to come out. The first of its kind as far as ocular treatments. It's kind of paving the way for us. Very exciting thing to talk about. And if you're somebody who has retinitis pigmentosa, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. And I think for everyone else, some hope as well to say, okay, if we can do it for one condition, we can do it for others. So again, what are the other ocular gene therapies in the works? Well, go back to clinicaltrials.gov. All these conditions that we talked about, Luxturna doesn't work for all retinitis pigmentosa, so they're working on the other kinds. They're working on achromatopsia. They're working on Leber's. They're working on macular degeneration. So go take a look at those studies if that's something that pertains to you. And I would encourage you, to talk to your retinal specialist as well and see if that's something that you should pursue. A few useful links to follow today, rarediseases.info. That's part of the National Institute of Health. So that'll talk about all kinds of rare diseases, which you can go to the eye disease section and go through there. PreventBlindness.org is a nonprofit group, talks all about different kinds of diseases. It's a great information source, a lot of good resources that you can feed out to. It's one I like to refer back to. And then Foundation Fighting Blindness, fightingblindness.org. Another great nonprofit group. Both of these are national nonprofit groups. So they've got chapters all around the country. They've got support systems. Foundation Fighting Blindness is really cool because they actually raise money for research against retina diseases specifically. So they have a program called the Vision Walk that they do once a year. And with COVID, it was all done virtually. But the year prior to COVID, the ViewFinder was able to be a part of that, to go and to walk and to raise money. It's good to raise money and give to a charity when you know where that money is going. So great programs, great people working at these programs. Some useful links to follow if you want to read up a little bit more. Definitely go through, National Institute of Health. If you want to look at clinical studies and read the actual numbers, those can be a little dry and a little intense for those who aren't used to reading scientific stuff. So let's take a look over to Facebook and see if we've pulled in any questions. Just Dr. Harrier letting us know that she can hear. So appreciate that again, Dr. Harrier. Okay. So if you do have questions that come up, about whether or not it's worth it to do this, if you should see a genetic counselor, if you should share these results with family, if there's a lot that broils into this. Definitely something to think about quite a bit. I would say, definitely something you can come in and talk to me about. I'm happy to take a whole session to do this. I do have ID or IRD testing kits at the office, both in Sun City and in Mesa. And if somebody requests it in Utah, I'll bring them up to Utah as well. It's a great opportunity to learn more about yourself. I myself, I'm going to be submitting for just kind of a whole body health one because I think the more information you know, the better. I don't really have a history of eye disease, so I wouldn't be eligible to submit this one. I'd feel bad taking advantage just because I'm the doctor. Um, but it is something I've done with patients already. We've gotten results back. When I get those results, I'll contact you and we can speak over the phone or we can come in and speak in person about what those results are and what that means and how you can move forward with that. Both of these groups, my Retina Tracker and ID or IRD, have associated genetic counselors. So if you want to talk to somebody who does genetics all day, every day, and can counsel you on family planning and things like that, I think it's an excellent idea. So definitely something I would push people towards. There's other great doctors in the area that do genetic testing. There's retinal specialists who do this. I know Dr. Bacall at the Associated Retina Consultants. He does a lot of this as well. He sees a lot of inherited conditions. So I'm not the only one you can go to for this, but I'm happy to help for anybody who's interested in finding more out about their retina. Again, just a simple saliva collection takes about 2 minutes, maybe 5 if you really dry mouth. And then we mail that in the mail and we get results back within a month. If you have any other questions, feel free to give us a ring, stop in with us, look up genetic counselors in your area and give them a ring as well. I'm excited to talk about next month's webinar as well. Next month, we'll be talking about employment for the visually impaired and blind. So that ranges from, being an entrepreneur and owning your own business to being an employee. Things like vocational rehabilitation and the state programs and nonprofit programs that are available to get people back to work or to keep the job that you have. So we'll have a special guest with us next month, David Steinmetz from Arizona Industries for the Blind. And that's a nonprofit group as well. Really cool, really one that you should read up on. They're involved in warehouse packing and digital scanning and all kinds of cool stuff, and employ a lot of good people doing a lot of good work. So just because you have a visual impairment doesn't mean that you're not able to hold a job. Doesn't mean that you're not able to be fully independent. And here at ViewFinder, that's definitely what we want to push you towards, is the opportunity to be fully independent, the opportunity to be fully functional, and to be able to live your life the way that you want to. We don't want to push people towards things that they're not interested in, but we do want to give you all the resources, all the tools, all the networking and awareness that we can. So thank you everybody for turning out today. Appreciate your time. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next month.